Chelsea Henderson, whom you're going to meet now, is Director of Editorial Content for republicEn, which refers to itself as a conservative answer to climate change. She hosts the Eco-Right Speaks podcast, manages Eco-Right Leadership, the Eco-Right Leadership Council program, and she's author of the book Glacial, the Inside Story of Climate Politics. After she speaks here for a few minutes, she'll be joined by Hattie Hobart, who's from the new organization Nature is Nonpartisan, new group, and my colleague here at GW and fellow journalist Jesse Holland. So for now, please welcome Chelsea Henderson. Chelsea. Welcome, and I'm leaving.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to Planet Forward for having me here this morning. As Frank mentioned, I'm Chelsea Henderson, the Director of Editorial Content for republicEn.org. If you are not familiar with our work, first of all, we are a project of the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. We're also headed up by former Congressman Bob Inglis from South Carolina. So early in Bob's career, he did not ascribe to climate change. He kind of touted what was then very much the party line, but he evolved. And he evolved to the point where he introduced a carbon tax bill. And the voters of South Carolina didn't like either of those things and let him know that by voting him out of office. Bob was undeterred. In fact, he doubled down, and he created this community where people who are right of center can come to either learn about climate change if you don't know the science, learn about different policy options, get the tools to be able to advocate for those options, and find how you can discover your voice and take a seat at the table. And I think that this is like such a critically important community for us to have, especially right now. I also, as Frank mentioned, am the author of Glacial, the Inside Story of Climate Politics, which took a mere 60-year look at federal efforts to try to enact climate change policy. My book begins with LBJ getting a briefing in 1965. So if you're not good at math, that's 60 years ago, in which the scientists said by the 21st century, we're going to be having more intense hurricanes, more frequently, wildfires, droughts, all the things we're experiencing today. And LBJ felt very strongly that we couldn't just punt to the next generation. We had to do something. And that kind of got the wheels in motion. We had this environmental awakening. I suspect that those of us who are working in the climate space right now are feeling a little frustrated. There does appear to be deep polarization, and it's not a time, I think, of robust hope. But one thing that I wanted to just emphasize, both from the work that we do at republicEn.org and the lessons that I learned from the book, is that in order for policy to be successful, it really has to be bipartisan. So if you look at the major efforts over the last, again, 60 years to implement some sort of climate policy, those that had bipartisan support kind of got the most traction, with the exception being the Inflation Reduction Act. While that was passed in a partisan way, the contents of that bill were quite bipartisan, had lots of different provisions that were supported by GOP lawmakers, which we're seeing today, both in the House and the Senate, some of those lawmakers saying to the leadership, please do not take a sledgehammer to the Inflation Reduction Act. So on polarization, we only stay polarized if we remain in our own corners and in our own echo chambers. We have to reach out to those who we don't see eye to eye with and have those difficult conversations. No one person, no one party is going to do everything, but we also can't shame people who are coming to the party late. So in 2000, John McCain was running for president, and he was in New Hampshire campaigning, and he got the question, what is your plan on climate change? And rather than making something up, as some lawmakers might do, he said, I don't have a plan, and I'm embarrassed I don't have a plan, but I'm gonna come up with one. And he came back to DC. He used his power of the Commerce Committee to have a host of hearings. He learned about the issue. He decided he wanted to write a bill, and he reached across the aisle to his best friend, Joe Lieberman, to work on a bill with him because he knew that was going to make the bill go farther. If we had shamed John McCain because he didn't have a climate plan, he never would have become one of the greatest GOP champions of climate change. In today's context, I look at now Senator John Curtis, who as a member of Congress founded the conservative House Climate Caucus. And I know at the time there was a lot of buzz. There were people in that caucus who had never said the words climate change, but we have to allow people to come in their own terms. And I know there is a sense of urgency and that can feel frustrating, but we have to create these openings so that we can have the conversation, because as Dr. Catherine Hayhoe says, the most important thing that you can do on climate change is have a conversation about it. I'm just gonna leave you with one little quick story because I see that timer. We have a member of our community, he is from a red state, he's a pastor, he is very for climate action, but he said that when he is in front of his congregation, he cannot say the words climate change because he would lose members of the congregation. But he has an EV, he has solar panels, he has battery to store the power that he generates, and he invites people for rides in his car, and he shows them that this is the power of the future, and he does all of this without saying the words climate change. So however you have to do it, I think we can make progress. And that is my little dash of hope, is that we can do this because we're strong, we're Americans, we're smart, and we're innovative, and we're really good at doing things when we need to. So with all that said, I only went 15 seconds over. I'd like to welcome Jesse and Hattie to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. We just heard some great information from Chelsea, but I want to give Hattie a chance here to tell us a little bit about what you and your organization does.
Yeah, so for anyone who's not familiar with us, and I'm sure most of you aren't because we are brand new, we launched all of 3.5 weeks ago, actually might be 4 today. Nature's Nonpartisan is a brand new 501c3 startup nonprofit, and we are focused on taking nature and conservation and the environmental movement out of the political back and forth. For a long time, we've seen a lot of, the right says that climate change doesn't exist, and the left says it's the biggest crisis to ever face our generation, our planet. And there is truth in the middle of that, and we're really focused on making it so that we don't have the partisan back and forth, and it's something that's really focused on making consistent, common sense differences for all Americans.
So that brings me to my first question for both of you, and Chelsea, I'll have you answer this first. So what's the biggest impediment, what's the biggest blocking point in getting conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats to talk together about climate change?
I think it's the labels, right? I think the labels are polarizing us. If we can have conversations as problem solvers, I mean, the climate change doesn't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or agnostic, right? If you live on the coast, you might experience sea level rise. You might live in a state where you can't insure your home anymore because the home insurers are fleeing. This is no longer just an environmental issue, it's an economic issue. And so we really do have to come to the table, not with labels on, but just with a willingness to solve the problem.
Hattie.
I think part of it is also the disconnect between where we're coming at it from. So if you talk to people and figure out where they actually connect to the land and connect to nature, you have a much easier time getting at kind of like where they care about all of these things, because at the end of the day, all Americans want clean water, clean air, and clean soil.
So that makes it sound like that there's a difference between rural conversations on the conservative side and urban conversations on the conservative side. So how do you get past all of those differences on one side before even talking to somebody on the who has ideological differences on the other spectrum? Is there work still to be done on the Republican and the conservative side before you can even start talking about bipartisan issues on the liberal and Democratic side?
Listen, do I wish that we had a lot more champions in Congress? Absolutely, but we have who we have, and so we have to be able to work with those members. And John Curtis is a great example. He's in the Senate now, and he is already forging bipartisan friendships. I saw when Senator Cory Booker was speaking on the floor a few weeks ago, I heard him say to whoever was sitting in the chair, I didn't know at the time, it did end up being John Curtis, that he was eager to write an energy bill with Mr. President, which is what you refer to the person who is presiding over the Senate. And then when the camera did pan to him, I was like, oh, it's John Curtis. John Curtis and Cory Booker should absolutely write a bill together. So you have to find the partnerships where you can, and then continue to build the coalition. And it might be that the coalition, some people are focused on the ag component, and some are focused on the home insurance component, and some are focused on combating wildfires, but you kind of let people figure out where they belong. But yes, we have to keep going, but we have to build the coalition too.
And Hattie, let me challenge a little bit the whole idea behind nature is nonpartisan. Nature may be nonpartisan, but solutions are often requires legislation or regulations, which are partisan. So how do you get partisanship out of nature? How do you get, when we know we need, well, I'm going to make an assumption, we know we need laws, we know we need regulations to fight climate change. How do you get partisanship out when you know you have to go through a legislative and executive solution to do anything?
I think part of it is proving that it can be done, which is something that we're working on at this point with Nature is Nonpartisan. But we're also working to build trust with other organizations and build those coalitions that you were talking about a little bit, Chelsea. But we're hoping to we don't want to recreate the wheel. We want to help connect people to opportunities to get their hands dirty and get involved with conservation organizations that are already doing good work. But all of that to say, you need people who know what they're talking about and know the land that they're working with and know the environmental issues that they're working with to speak up and become some of those champions that you were talking about as well, and to build trust outside of those partisan kind of influences. Because at the end of the day, I think we can make well-informed policy decisions as long as the right voices are speaking up and championing them.
Can I add to
Sure,
her?
please.
So if you look at the history of environmental statutes, the early 70s were kind of our nascent, right, our rebirth that we were going to take care of the environment. We were going to do this by creating an EPA and having a Clean Water Act and a Clean Air Act and Endangered Species Act. And those bills all passed with maybe 2 or 3 dissenters, right? It was very bipartisan. If you move into the 80s, when President Reagan was ushering through the Montreal Protocol, which is considered the most successful international treaty, international environmental treaty that phased out CFCs, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. The Senate confirmed that. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it was very overwhelming bipartisan support to ratify that treaty. And even the creation of the UNFCCC, which is the UN's governing climate body, passed 92-8 or something along those lines. So we have had these moments in history of where it was nonpartisan. And we just have to find our way back there, because we all benefit from the planet, we all drink the water, we all breathe the air, and it is really about all our livelihoods.
So I'm glad you brought up the 70s and 80s, because that's the area I was going to. I'm not going to say whether I was born in the 70s or not, but do we see a difference now with our current Gen Z generation and how they feel about the environment and when it comes to politics? Are we seeing more conservative and Republican Gen Zers more willing to talk about, more willing to cross party lines and step away from the ideological differences to talk about some type of solution?
I don't know if I can speak specifically to Gen Z, but I do know that, as we were researching some of the stuff that helps support kind of our mission at Nature is Nonpartisan, we found that in the 70s and 80s, almost 80% of Americans identified as environmentalists, and that number is so much closer to 40% now, which is a crazy drop off. And that really started in the 90s and the 2000s, when some really partisan figures got involved with the environmental movement. So I think that, as we're all realizing that it is a pressing issue, and we're seeing the effects of things like hurricanes and wildfires, and all the other natural disasters that have gotten so much worse in the last couple of years, it is something that's starting to bring us together as we start seeing communities come together and start caring for each other in response to these things.
All right, so Chelsea, I'm going to ask for some specific advice from you here. So if you are a Democratic environmentalist, how do you start a conversation with a Republican over climate change? What do you say to make sure it's a positive conversation and not confrontational?
I think the first thing is to not come at it from a perspective of spouting scientific figures, unless you were talking to a scientist, because that can make somebody, I don't know, if somebody starts throwing stats at me and I know that we are coming from a different perspective, I'm gonna freeze up, right? Because I might not have my own stats to back it up. But can you find some common ground? Do you both like, or maybe you're both vegan, right? And you can use that example. Hattie and I were actually talking about our fondness of not being vegan before
Yeah, I
the
grew
show.
up on a farm.
So-
Vegan doesn't make sense to me, but it's good. It's good for some people.
Right. Or the example I gave in the intro, our member who is part of the clergy, and he can talk about faith with his members, and he can talk about, I harness the sun, which God gave us. I can't make that kind of argument because I'm not a person that is a regular churchgoer or anything, but for some people, find the connecting point. Is it faith? Is it ag? Is it that you like technology? Whatever it is, find it. It doesn't have to be, we're trying to stop the earth from getting 2 degrees Celsius warm. Like, you can take some of the wonkiness out and just make it real. Maybe you liked ice fishing as a kid and you went ice fishing with an older family member and you can't anymore because the lake doesn't freeze over. Like, find the commonality and work from there.
And let me flip that around for you, and I got one for you in 1 second, Hattie. If you're a conservative environmentalist, how do you start that conversation with a liberal environmentalist and not have it be confrontational?
I think it's really important to maybe acknowledge up front that you might have different approaches to solving climate change, but that you want to be at the table together, because for too long Republicans weren't sitting at the table. They'd sort of taken themselves out of the conversation. And so I understand why some folks on the right might think, okay, well, this is our issue now and we're gonna run with it. So I think just sharing that acknowledgement that, hey, I'm here and I wanna have a discussion and I wanna have an honest discussion.
So Hattie, now that we've got this great advice from this side, how do you have those conversations without it becoming partisan, without it becoming political?
I think you honestly have to make it personal. So one of the things that I really relied on when I was recruiting with the American Conservation Coalition was figuring out where people connected to the land. And I was talking to a lot of college kids across the West. So I was like, hey, do you like skiing? Do you like hiking? Do you like being outside with your friends on the weekends? Or skipping class to go skiing on a powder day, and coming at it from that more personal angle and figuring out where exactly these people, connect to the land and where you guys overlap in that connection is where I think you can start finding that common ground and then, exploring solutions from there. Because at the end of the day, I think everyone wants to, preserve nature and make sure that these wild spaces and beautiful national parks and outdoor spaces are available and accessible to generations to come. But we might have different ideas of what that looks like and the specifics of how we get there. But at the end of the day, that's kind of the same common goal.
What's the low-hanging fruit right now that both conservatives and liberals, Republicans, Democrats can achieve immediately on climate change and environmentalism without falling into these partisan differences? Is there a particular area either one of you see that can be worked on right now that both sides of the aisle both feel strongly about?
Wow. Do you have an idea? If you have one, jump in.
One of the ones that we've been talking about at Nature's Nonpartisan has been more of the natural climate solutions route. So whether that's proactive forestry management so that we don't have crazy wildfires, or working to build buffers in coastal regions with mangroves or something that's more relevant to whatever ecosystem that you're working with, allowing us to do a little bit more proactive natural disaster management and natural climate solutions that help buffer some of the responses and the disastrous nature of those disasters, I think is a good one that's probably some lower hanging fruit. And then also with the West, maintaining some of those ecosystems and building out, ecosystem connectivity is another one that I think would be on the easier side of things.
I did think of something that's a little more broad. Climate change is not in a silo an issue by itself, right? Climate change is an environmental issue for sure and a conservation issue, but it's an agricultural issue. It's a public health issue. It's an economic issue. It's a transportation issue. I think that when we are when Congress is considering big bills, big solutions to problems, there has to be a climate lens applied to that so that we're not just solving these problems and then creating new ones. You're looking at things more holistically, and that is something that I feel like people could do in a bipartisan way.
Okay. As we start to wrap up, my question for you, Chelsea, who are some of the climate champions on the Republican and conservative side that you would say liberals and Democrats need to pay attention to?
Well, obviously, Bob Inglis, my boss. I'm not just saying that because he's my boss. I mean, I just think he's so inspiring the way that he has continued over the years to build this community. And I also think that John Curtis, he is somebody who just seems like was born to be in the Senate, and he's making friends and getting along. And then there's this group of members of Congress in the House who have supported the Inflation Reduction Act, and they're led by Congressman Andrew Garabino. And so I think that that's another person to be watching.
Hattie, where should we be paying attention to issues that Nature's Nonpartisan is looking at and working on coming up in the future? Where should we be watching?
We're working on a pretty broad marketing scheme, so if you don't see us, let us know. But all that to say, definitely keep an eye on our Instagram, on our website, and then if you are open to it, feel free to sign our pledge and keep in touch with us as well.
Well, I would like to thank both Chelsea Henderson and Hattie Hobart for coming up and having this conversation about having respectful differences in climate change between the parties. I'd like to thank all of you for listening. Ladies, thank you so much for this conversation.